Hello, students. Well, we're up to the administration of President Harry S. Truman in Lecture 12. Um, so, as I mentioned in the last lecture, it was really World War II and the massive federal expenditures on war supplies that put an end to both the Depression and the New Deal programs. Um, Once the war ended in 1945, Americans were ready for a change. They had suffered through 16 years, first of the Depression, then of the wartime deprivation, rationing of food, serving in the military, all the sacrifices that went along with the war. And they were ready for prosperity, they were ready for the good life. And they were ready to spend the newfound money they had, now that everybody was fully employed, um, on consumer goods. So what you see immediately after World War II is just a deluge of advertising, convincing people that their time had come to enjoy themselves and that they should invest in new consumer goods, like, for instance, the Nash motor car you see in this advertisement on the right hand side. There had not been one automobile produced for the consumer market during World War II because all the auto factories were producing more materiel. Um, and so, as soon as those factories were converted back to producing for the consumer market, you see a rush of people buying cars, washing machines, whatever was available. And economists call this a culture of rising expectations. In other words, after all the suffering they'd been through, people now expected all the comforts of life. They expected prosperity, and that's what they demanded, as a matter of fact. And you see a big change also in the approach that labor unions took after the war. Basically, they lost their radical edge. They stopped trying to revolutionize the whole society um, by getting the government to institute new programs on their behalf. And instead, with huge profits being made by large corporations, they simply want their piece of that pie of prosperity, and the corporations could afford to give it to them. They needed workers, after all, in this climate of full employment. And so it's really the post World War II years that are the good old days as far as work in the United States in terms of the benefits that people received. Corporations gave free health insurance, free pensions, cost of living allowances. That meant that wages would automatically go up every year according to the rate of inflation. We call this liberal capitalism. This is kind of capitalism without the rough edge that it had before. It's a kind of capitalism that benefits both the capitalists and the workers. And the result for workers is that instead of fighting tooth and nail to try to get benefits and privileges that they didn't have, the workers now pretty much have everything that they had ever fought for. And so their focus shifts, and the focus of labor unions shifts to protecting the privileges that they have. And so again, they really lose that radical edge they had before, because the workers now, you could say, they're haves. They have prosperity, and they have a good standard of living. They're not have-nots anymore. And not surprisingly, after the war was over and all the soldiers returned, you see a big surge in terms of marriages and also pregnancies. But actually, if you look carefully at the data, you see that already began even during the war, because in wartime, really, all bets are off in terms of sexual morality. You have soldiers going off to war and their girlfriends not knowing if they'll ever see them again. So often it happened even during the war years that women got pregnant and would end up getting married or married their soldiers just before they shipped out and so forth. So you see an increase in the rate of marriages and pregnancies during World War II. After the war, the divorce rate goes down pretty dramatically. There was a brief spike in divorces upward just after the war as soldiers came home, perhaps changed by their experience and not fitting back into the world, the ordinary world, very well. But over time, in the late 40s and 50s, the divorce rate really drops quite a bit. So these marriages tended to last, and furthermore, they tended to start very early. In the years after World War II, um, the average man was married by age 22, and the average woman was already married at age 20. Now, it's interesting that although there was such an emphasis on marriage and having babies after World War II, a lot of these married women actually did stay in the workforce. By 1950, you see that 34% of women had jobs outside the home, and more than half of those working women were married women. So, why did they do that? Well, again, they had had that taste of independence during World War II, filling in for their men who were away at the war, but also a great desire, again, to cash in and to really enjoy the good things that were available that were being turned out by corporations, and to be able to buy stuff to invest in that nice little house in the suburbs that was everybody's goal, and to watch your family grow. And it was really, really extraordinary how the birth rate took off in the post-war years. 3.4 million babies were born in 1946. That figure shot up to 3.8 million in 1947. And every year between 1954 and 1964, more than 4 million babies were born every year in the United States. And of course, we call this the baby boom. And it's this generation, the boomer generation, of course, that's now growing elderly and is in need of health care, is starting to collect Social Security, which is creating a huge crisis for us in terms of funding those entitlement programs now that this big baby boom bubble generation has grown old. So that's a problem that all of you will be facing as taxpayers in the near future. Another important development after World War II had to do with a law that Congress had passed during the war that was popularly known as the GI Bill of Rights. And what the GI Bill did was to promise that soldiers, after they got back from serving their country, would enjoy federal subsidies if they wanted to buy a house. So this really fuels the boom in home construction that happens after the war, and especially the growth of suburbs. But also, the returning veterans were entitled to a free education. And so it's really after World War II that for the first time it becomes normal for men to go to college and to get a college degree, because they can do that for free. And also, more and more women were going to college. And so you also see a real boom in higher education, the construction of many new colleges and universities to accommodate these people that are now seeking higher education, who would never have done that before. Darden, I would say, comes in on the very end of this tendency, but is still part of it, being opened in the early 1960s to accommodate this big surge in college enrollment. Well, now let's turn to the topic that really overshadowed almost everything else during the late 40s and the 50s, and that is the Cold War. Why do we call it the Cold War? Well, it was basically a rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Um, and during this whole period, the United States and the Soviet Union never actually went to war against each other. There were wars that both sides were involved in, but they were usually carried out in places like Korea and Vietnam, sort of proxy wars. But the U.S. and the USSR didn't really have a shooting war during this period, and so we call it the Cold War. But it was a period of incredible tension that lasted all the way from 1945 to 1991, in which the whole world was overshadowed by the threat of nuclear war now that the world had entered the atomic age. So, a little background on how the Cold War shaped up. Well, first of all, the Soviet Union had suffered really more than any other country, including Germany, during World War II. After Hitler invaded the USSR, more than 23 million Soviet citizens were killed as a direct result of the conflict. And so, as the war was coming to an end, you better believe that the communist dictator Joseph Stalin expected the Soviet Union to get some rewards. And specifically, he had his sights set on Eastern Europe. He wanted to transform all of Eastern Europe into part of the Soviet sphere of influence, essentially to take over Eastern Europe. And it's interesting, one episode in World War II really sort of points to that plan in Stalin's mind. In August 1944, the few Jews that were left alive in Warsaw, Poland, had been herded into an area called the ghetto. And finally, in desperation, they decided to stage a revolt against the Nazis. Now, by this point in time, the Soviet army was quite close to Warsaw, and it would have been very easy for Stalin to order his troops to go into Warsaw and support the Warsaw Uprising. But instead, Stalin just sat and looked on as the Nazis came in and crushed the revolt. Now, why did he do that? Well, if you think about it for a second, really, Stalin allowed Hitler to do his dirty work for him and to destroy whatever leaders were left in the city of Warsaw, so that after the war, when Stalin took over Poland, there wouldn't be anyone there to resist him. Why didn't Churchill and Roosevelt try to stop Stalin from taking over Eastern Europe? Well, there were several reasons for that. The main one was that we were still fighting in 1944 and early 1945, a very bitter war against the Japanese, and it wasn't by any means certain that we were going to win. And so FDR really hoped that the Soviets would be willing to come into the Pacific War on our side against Japan. And he took that wish to the negotiating table in February 1945 at a conference in Yalta in the Soviet Union with Churchill and Stalin. And it was really at this conference that essentially Churchill and FDR gave Stalin permission to take over much of Eastern Europe. For instance, they specifically allowed Stalin to annex part of Poland and to make it officially part of the Soviet Union. And in return, Stalin did agree to eventually come into the war against Japan. He promised that there would be a, quote, mighty, free, and independent Poland, end quote. It is true that the Soviets did eventually come into the Pacific War 3 days after we dropped the A-bomb on Hiroshima. So by then we really didn't need them anymore. And so we didn't really get much in exchange uh, for allowing Stalin to take over Eastern Europe. And as it turned out, of course, none of the countries in Eastern Europe would turn out to be mighty, free, or independent under Soviet domination. Now, after the war, it began to dawn on US and British leaders what exactly we had done in allowing Stalin to take over Eastern Europe. You see on the map there um, a black line surrounding the countries of Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, and including also Poland and the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. This line became known as the Iron Curtain. It was the line that marked the boundary between the free world and the communist world. And the man who coined this phrase, Iron Curtain, was, none other than Winston Churchill, who had actually been voted out of office in 1945 in Britain. So he was no longer prime minister. Harry S. Truman invited Churchill to come to give a college graduation speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, Truman's home state. And so this is where Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. And at this point, I'd like for you to go to the supplementary videos folder and watch a brief snippet of the Iron Curtain speech. Okay, welcome back. I think it's very interesting at the end of that historic speech that, in a way, Churchill explains why suddenly the US and Britain had become so hostile towards the Soviet Union when they had, in fact, been our allies during World War II. He talks about Hitler and how the rise of Hitler, and in fact World War II itself, could have been prevented if the European powers had just stopped Hitler, not allowed him to take over any more territory, and enforced the Treaty of Versailles against Germany before World War II. And so, with respect to the Soviets, there was this sense that, we let Hitler get away with it. We can't let that happen again. We can't let the Soviets get any farther in their quest for world domination. We have to stop them in their tracks. And so that memory of Hitler, I think, was very key in terms of firing up Cold War hostility against the Soviet Union. Well, just a little bit about President Harry S. Truman. He was a senator from Missouri. He was FDR's vice president. He became president when FDR died at Warm Springs. And it was Truman, of course, who dropped the A-bomb on Japan. That's a bit of recap for you. Just want to mention, notice that Harry Truman's middle initial S does not have a period after it. You may think that's a typo. Well, it isn't. When Harry Truman was born, his parents just wanted to call him Harry Truman. And the guy who made out his birth certificate thought, well, poor kid, he should at least have a middle initial. And so he wrote in S. So really, Harry Truman's middle name was S, which is why there's no period there. Now, Harry Truman was never an extremely popular president. His approval ratings were generally pretty low. To be fair, following FDR, that was a very hard act to follow, and almost nobody could have filled those shoes. Excuse me. But Harry Truman had a lot of virtues as president. He was a very plain-spoken and direct man. He told voters the truth. He was always very, very honest and frank with people, and he took responsibility for his actions. He had a little sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." In those days, if you were the kind of person that would just kind of try to avoid making any decisions or taking responsibility for anything, they call that passing the buck, all right? Or like it's kind of like kicking the can down the road, just trying to avoid responsibility. Well, Truman's saying, no more passing the buck. The buck stops here, right on my desk in the Oval Office. And for the most part, Harry Truman did live up to that. Now, um, Cold War strategy for the United States. Uh, One very important moment in the formation of the strategy came in February 1946, and it had to do with a diplomat named George Kennan, who was stationed in Moscow in the Soviet Union. And one night, Kennan sent a very, very long telegram back to the State Department in Washington outlining his views of the Soviet Union. And basically, what Kennan said was the Soviet Union wants world domination. They will stop at nothing to get it. There's no way to talk to these people or compromise with them. What we need to do is contain them. Basically, stop them from taking over any more territory anywhere in the world. And we need to do that by forming alliances with many other countries wherever we can to try to stop Soviet expansion and keep them from taking over the world. So this idea was called containment, and it really became the official policy of the U.S. During the Cold War. For example, in March 1947, Truman announced in a speech that the U.S. should, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. What's he saying there? Well, he's saying there are free people in the world who are at risk of being taken over by outside pressures or by our minorities, namely communists. And became the Americans' foreign policy to support any country that was in that situation. This statement became known as the Truman Doctrine, and it became really one of the foundations of the Cold War. So how were we going to win over all of these other free countries that were threatened by communism to our side? Well, partly through military support, but perhaps even more important was economic aid, giving them money, giving them our technology and other stuff to make them happy so that they would be our friends. And this program really got underway in Europe with what became known as the Marshall Plan, that was designed by the Secretary of State George C. Marshall. And so essentially it was the United States that rebuilt Europe, even Germany, after World War II. After we had spent billions of dollars to defeat Germany, it was the United States that went in with our cash and essentially rebuilt that country and made it into the industrial powerhouse that it is today. And in the late 1940s, we could afford to do that because our economy was still booming. These were really the good old days in terms of the American economy, and we'll probably never see anything like this again. In the late 1940s, we only had 7% of the world population. However, American citizens accounted for 42% of the world's income, and we produced about half of all the manufactured products that were produced in the entire world. Okay, this country alone. So we were the economic powerhouse, and that meant that we had the funds, we had the tax revenue to give this kind of foreign aid. So the Marshall Plan was officially known as the European Recovery Program. It started in April of 1948, and it was very successful. After the Marshall Plan was instituted, no more European countries went communist, besides the one that had already fallen behind the Iron Curtain. But this required an expenditure of $13.34 billion of American tax revenue in 4 years. So we can call the Marshall Plan an example of what political scientists call soft power. Hard power would be an invasion or some kind of military intervention, but soft power means winning people over by giving them things or persuading them to join your side. And we persuaded many countries, not just in Europe, but in Africa and Asia throughout the world, to become our allies by sending them things like weapons, but also TVs, microwave ovens, and so forth. I should say this image, obviously on the left, is very difficult to look at, and I'm just showing it to you because I think it helps explain a very important feature of U.S. foreign policy after the war, namely our support for the new nation of Israel. But first, um, one of the great achievements coming out of World War II was the United Nations. And unlike the League of Nations, the United States did join the United Nations. In fact, the conference that produced the UN Charter took place in San Francisco in 1945. A little bit about the UN. How does it work? Well, it has what's called a General Assembly, and all the member nations send representatives to this General Assembly, and they all have voting rights in the Assembly. So the Assembly can propose motions and vote on them, things that it wants the United Nations to do. But the real power in the United Nations lies with a smaller group called the Security Council. And on the Security Council, some members rotate on and off, but there are 5 countries that are always members of the Security Council, namely the United States, the United Kingdom. In those days, the Soviet Union. Now that the USSR is gone, that seat is held by Russia, France, and China. And the Security Council members have a special power, which is that any member of the Security Council can at any time veto any resolution that's been passed by the General Assembly. And so having a permanent seat on the Security Council is an incredibly powerful and prestigious position. And for example, we've seen in recent history that the UN really wanted to do something in Syria, but Russia basically threatened to veto anything that the United States tried to do because Syria is their ally, and so the UN hasn't been able to do a thing there. One of the great achievements of the early United Nations was a document called the Declaration of Human Rights, setting forth basic human rights that all people in the world have. And it's interesting that the chair of the committee that produced this document was none other than FDR's widow, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of our representatives at the United Nations. And so she really did a great job helping to create this document and get it passed. And so Eleanor Roosevelt really had a very, until her death, was actually a very, very influential figure, not only in the politics of this country, but of the entire world. So, back to the issue of Israel. Now, after World War II and after the Holocaust became known and people realized how much the Jews had suffered from Hitler's tyranny, there was a lot of sympathy for the Jewish people, and there was a desire to give them their own national homeland so that they would never again have to suffer the kind of persecution they had endured from the Nazis. So the United Nations got involved in trying to settle this issue because the problem was the Jews wanted to go back to Palestine, the land of the Bible where they had formerly had a kingdom in the times of the Old Testament. But the problem was that there were already millions of Arabs living there, Palestinians, and that was their home as well. And they didn't want to move and vacate their homes for the Jewish state. So in 1947, the UN came up with a plan for a two-state solution, that parts of Palestine would belong to the Jews and parts would belong to the Palestinians. The Jews actually accepted the UN plan, but the Arabs objected to it. They did not accept it, and they attacked the Jewish settlers in Palestine. Well, the Jews fought back very effectively, defeated the Arabs, and then announced that they were creating their own nation, the State of Israel, in 1948. And ever since, Israel has been one of the United States' main allies in the world. And again, it's not hard to see why. With the picture on the left there, people were so shocked and so horrified by what had happened in the concentration camps that we were really willing to bend over backwards to do anything we could to try to redress that great injustice. And so um, we have always supported the State of Israel. But again, this is one of those problems that has its roots in history that still hasn't been solved. Obviously, the Palestinians and the Israelis are still at each other's throats, and there really is no solution in sight. Well, the flashpoint for many moments of Cold War tension was the city of Berlin. And Berlin was kind of a special case because if you look at the map on the left here, um, when World War II ended, basically the British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets had all established zones of influence there in different colors on the map in Germany. And the Soviets had the entire eastern part of Germany. But in the city of Berlin, which was in East Germany, there was a Soviet zone and there was a Western zone, or an Allied zone, in which the United States had most of the authority. And so after World War II, what you get is a communist country, East Germany, with a city in it, Berlin, that has a little enclave of American held influence in the from the free world. It's totally surrounded by a communist nation, and obviously that was a recipe for a lot of conflict. The first real crisis came in 1948. Now, there was a highway through Germany. Hitler had built it, called the Autobahn, and you can still drive the Autobahn today. There is no speed limit, by the way. Stalin decided to close off the Autobahn so that no supplies could come from West Germany and the free world to West Berlin. And Truman's response was that every day for several months, U.S. Aircraft would land in West Berlin, carrying with them all the supplies that the citizens of West Berlin needed to survive. And this was called the Berlin Airlift. So basically, this was a case where Truman really looked Stalin in the eye and refused to back down. And eventually, Stalin had to cave in and allow the West Berliners to continue existing as part of the free world. But we'll see later in the course that problems would come up again and again with respect to West Berlin. Turning to an issue I mentioned in the last lecture, the effects of World War II for African Americans. Well, just imagine, okay, let's say you're a black soldier, or a black nurse for that matter, or a WAC, one of the female service people. And you've been serving your country during World War II, you've been in harm's way, maybe you've even been wounded, or you've seen one of your close friends get killed on the front lines. Well, those people served their country, and when they got back home, especially those that lived in the South under the Jim Crow laws, their attitudes were changed. They were no longer willing to accept segregation and all the discrimination that went along with Jim Crow. They felt they were entitled to more because they had bled for their country, they had served their country. And very typical of this attitude was a comment made by an African American corporal from Alabama in 1945. He said, quote, well, excuse this language, he said, "I went into the army a nigger. I'm coming out a man," end quote. So basically, these people were not going to take it anymore, and they came back with a much more radical attitude. And out of that, really, I think the civil rights movement is born. One example of this is from the sports world. Jackie Robinson was a second lieutenant in a segregated unit in U.S. Armed Forces. He actually was discharged from the service. He got a good discharge, but he was discharged because he refused to ride on a segregated bus at a military base. And so Jackie Robinson was always unwilling to accept the status quo in terms of race. After the war, he played football for a while, but then he signed a contract for the Major League Baseball team, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he started out in their farm system, and he did very well. So in 1947, he was called up to the big leagues and became the first African American to play Major League Baseball, except in the Negro Leagues. Okay, there had formerly been this organization known as the Negro Leagues with all black teams, so there was a segregated Negro League. But Jackie Robinson was the first to break the color bar and to enter into Major League Baseball in 1947. And he suffered terrible persecution for that. Hate mail, the comments of other players and fans who would throw things at him on the field. Sometimes players would sharpen their spikes and try to spike him on the field. But he endured all this very bravely and very calmly, and became Rookie of the Year in 1947. And I think this was incredibly important in jump-starting the civil rights movement. After all, baseball was the big sport at that time. And just the idea that you could go to a Major League Baseball stadium and see an integrated baseball game, see black athletes and white athletes playing together, really, I think, started to change people's minds and to give them the possibility, at least, that integration would be a good thing. Well, Harry S. Truman actually was quite progressive in terms of the African American community. In 1947, he created a commission to study the predicament of blacks in the South, and this commission produced a report called "To Secure These Rights" that talked about violations of black civil rights and called for more rights for blacks, especially voting rights in the South. So in response, on February the 2nd, 1948, Truman publicly asked Congress to produce legislation that would allow African Americans to vote in the South. And that was a very brave thing for Truman to do because in that year he was running for president in his own right, and he needed the support of white Southerners to win. And in fact, at the Democratic Convention of that year, in response to Truman's stance in favor of black civil rights, a group of Southern Democrats walked out of the Democratic Convention, had their own convention, and nominated a hardline segregationist named Strom Thurmond as their candidate for president. So this group became known as the Dixiecrats, and Thurmond ran as a third-party candidate against Truman. Well, at this point, you might expect Truman to back down and to take it back and to try to win back those Dixiecrats to vote for him. Not at all. That was not the way Harry Truman operated. Just a couple of weeks later, Truman officially issued the order that desegregated not only the federal government, but also the entire U.S. Armed Services. So segregation was abolished by executive order by Harry S. Truman on July 26, 1948. There was some pushback and resistance from some of the armed services, and it took several years for this to be fully implemented. But it was really thanks to Harry Truman that the U.S. military was integrated. Well, you see here on the electoral map the results of the 1948 election. The Republican candidate was Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York, and basically everybody expected Dewey to beat Truman. Nobody thought Truman had a chance, especially with Strom Thurmond running and taking away votes from the Democratic Party. And people were so certain about this that on the night of the election, the Chicago Tribune came out with an extra edition with the headline you see there in the picture, Dewey defeats Truman. But that is not what happened. Miraculously, Harry Truman, having gone through the country on a whistle-stop tour by train, reaching out to the voters, miraculously Truman got enough electoral votes to win the presidency, even though Thurmond actually had won 4 southern states. And so this famous picture of Truman grinning and holding up this paper with the headline. But Truman's second administration would be very much overshadowed by events in Korea. The first thing that happened that really hurt Truman came in October of 1949. I mentioned earlier that in China there had been a long civil war going on between the government of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Nationalist Party, against the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. And finally, in October 1949, the Communists defeated the Nationalists, took over mainland China, and they declared it the People's Republic of China, as it still is today under Communist leadership. The Nationalist Party left, and they emigrated from mainland China, and they settled on an island off the coast of China called Taiwan. And they declared that they were the official government of China. And so for a number of years, Taiwan was really our ally, and the People's Republic of China was our enemy. When I was a kid, stuff you bought in stores didn't say made in China, it said made in Taiwan, because they were the ones we traded with. And also for a number of years, Taiwan had the Chinese seat on the UN Security Council, not the People's Republic. Well, Harry S. Truman took a lot of heat for what became known as the loss of China. The most populated country in the world had gone communist, and people felt like it had happened on Truman's watch, and he was responsible. Now, this was really setting the scene for the war that was soon to erupt in Korea. I mentioned that Japan had controlled Korea from 1905 to 1945. After the war, Korea was split in half at the 38th degree of latitude, the 38th parallel. The northern part of Korea was under the influence of the Soviet Union, and South Korea was pretty much controlled by the U.S. But on June 25th, 1950, the communist regime in North Korea launched an invasion of South Korea, and they moved forward very quickly. They captured the capital of South Korea, Seoul, and pretty much all of South Korea in a very short time. Well, Truman's response was to go to the United Nations and to ask for a UN resolution to create what was called a police action, a United Nations force to go in to Korea and to try to take South Korea back from the communists. And that's exactly what happened. So why didn't the Soviets veto the police action by the UN? Well, it just so happened that the Soviets were boycotting the whole UN for a time, so they were mad that the People's Republic of China was not being allowed to sit on the Security Council. So they had sort of taken their ball and gone home for a while. They weren't in the UN. And so we were able to get this resolution passed and to get this multinational force created. But it was really the United States that was in command of this UN army in Korea. And the head commander was General Douglas MacArthur, very charismatic military leader. And so, under the leadership of MacArthur, the UN troops landed in Korea and quickly pushed back the communists back to the 38th parallel. And then MacArthur went to Truman and asked for permission to continue the attack and to take over North Korea as well. And finally, Truman agreed. So MacArthur continued his very successful campaign, and the communists were pushed all the way back to the Chinese border. Well, um, that made the People's Republic of China very nervous. They have this large American-led army sitting right on their border, and it did not help that MacArthur let it be known that he thought we should go on, attack China, and in fact drop nuclear weapons on China to take China back from the communists. And so the Chinese were so alarmed by these statements and by the UN army that they sent an enormous army of about 1 million soldiers across the North Korean border to attack MacArthur's troops, and pushed the UN army backwards again, almost to the 38th parallel. Well, by this point in time, Truman was getting very, very nervous and antsy, and he wanted out of this conflict. And so he put out feelers to the communists to go to the negotiating table and create a settlement. MacArthur then made public statements to the effect that Truman was wrong and that we should not negotiate with the communists. And that was too much for Harry Truman. And so on April 11th, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command for insubordination. But MacArthur was a hugely popular figure in the country, very successful military leader, and so when he got back to America, he was met with parades and huge show of support, and he even got to give a speech to Congress in which he made the famous statement, quote, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," end quote. Well, after MacArthur was fired, pretty much the war settled down into a stalemate near the 38th parallel line, and there was a great deal of loss of life on both sides with very little to show for it, and this really hurt Truman's popularity. Another factor that hurt the Truman administration was the activities of Senator Joseph McCarthy, a hardline anti-communist who in 1950, in a famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, announced that he had a secret list of 205 federal employees in the Truman administration who were actually communists. And a lot of people believed McCarthy, and this was the beginning of the period of anti-communist witch hunts in the government and also in other fields like the movie business, entertainment, that we call McCarthyism. So McCarthy was really a thorn in Truman's side. The war was a thorn in Truman's side. And so in 1952, Truman chose not to seek re-election. But we'll deal with the election of 52 in the next lecture.